This is Duke University.
Any account of contemporary sport and mega events inevitably ends up looking at the IOC and FIFA, and what we generally find is their contribution to the to global good practice in global governance, as well as the organisation of the events that they're engaged with. The record is really very poor, and this seems to me, on the one hand, almost inevitable given their kind of historical formation, but deeply politically and ethically disappointing. And I say that because, without wishing to sound overly romantic, I believe that the Olympic Games and the Football World Cup are very rare and precious things in an incredibly globalised yet similarly incredibly divided world. We really lack genuine festivals, symbols or moments of a cosmopolitan, universal humanity. And for all the cynicism that we rightly have about the way in which these events are conceptualised and staged, they still, despite everything, retain something of that at their core. And that seems to me something not only worth preserving, but actually kind of fighting for, and for having institutions that match up to the expectations that that kind of festival and that kind of politics has. So let's imagine what would a world look like in which the IOC and FIFA and other sporting organisations at a global level actually reflected the best of those sort of political and ethical traditions. I think in the first place, there's just a question of democratisation and governance at a global level, and that's clearly where change is needed. We've had some of this change, it's worth saying, within the IOC since the 2002 Salt Lake City Olympic bidding scandal, which forced a degree of reform on the IOC, but even there it's pretty limited. And what does that agenda look like? Well, the first thing is these have to be open and transparent organisations, rather than coming at the bottom of Transparency International's annual review of global governance. There really is no reason why they shouldn't be absolutely at the top. There's nothing that these organisations do financially or institutionally, it seems to me, that should be secret from the global public. They hold these sports and these occasions in trust for the rest of us. I see no reason why all documentation and all finances should not be completely open. And I think that in and of itself would force a degree of political change and democratisation on those organisations, because if you can't hide behind a veil of secrecy, you have to start shaping up. I think the second thing to say is you've got to have term limits. I mean, clearly, and the Olympic movement has come around to this, the power of incumbency in global organisations where you have really no organised opposition, precious little scrutiny, and systems of patronage in which status, money and power radiates from the centre out to the peripheries, and the peripheries are the people who vote for whoever is going to run these organisations. That needs to end. That really needs to end. And until there is some, as with all political elites, and why should sports organisations be different? If you haven't got an opposition, then you become corrupt and you become contemptuous and you believe yourself invulnerable and no longer need to consult with a wider constituency. So I'm all for a little bit of fear being introduced into the system. I think the third thing is to remember with these organisations that they are made up of other organisations. I mean, in the end, FIFA is an organisation that is made up of 205 or 207 national football associations. The IOC, although obviously it's a self-selecting oligarchy of global aristocrats, also has to take note of the international sporting federations, which are a constituent part of the IOC itself. And those organisations are, if anything, as undemocratic and untransparent as the international organisations. Though, to be fair, and this again gives us a little bit of political hope, we do in, let's take Norway for example, the Norwegian Football Association is a model of openness, transparency and kind of reasoned conversation. And so at least there's somebody fighting that case potentially within those organisations, but we need reform at a national level, and that is the responsibility of those sports cultures as well as their national governments and national politics. The fourth thing, I think, is these organisations, I think they've just really begun to realise it with the seriousness that is required, is that mega events unleash a process of urban regeneration and urban change amongst their hosts. And that is potentially a great thing. However, the legitimacy and the catalytic political effect of getting the label of the Olympics and the World Cup is actually being used as a cover for the most part to allow very undemocratic and, to my mind, very unequal forms of urban regeneration. And you know, the experience of the Olympics in particular, but increasingly the World Cup as it gets bigger, is absolutely littered with examples of this. So I think we need these organisations in public global consultation to draw up a different set of criteria for awarding and running their events. I mean, you know, just to look at the question of displacements, you know, from Seoul 1988 to the present day, every Olympic Games has involved, you know, the knocking down of, you know, homes, shops and offices, often very unfair or completely unremunerated forms of relocation, particularly in countries which have weak civil societies and weak judiciaries. In the case of Beijing, 1 million people are moved for the Olympics, you know, and some of them are moved somewhere nice and many of them not so nice. And I think this is the line in the sand. We cannot continue to say, here's global humanity in all its athletic glory, and for it to be built on land that people have been turfed out of. So I think we have to have a complete rewriting of the expectations of what will and will not happen. But here's the really important thing. You know, we already have this to some extent in the Olympic movement. There is, you know, the question of environmental legacy is now the third pillar of Olympism, to use the language of the IOC. And, you know, Athens 2004, the most disastrous environmental Olympics ever. It was completely clear 2-3 years out from the staging of the Games that Athens was going to meet none of its environmental criteria. But the IOC and FIFA in particular, you know, if you're going to lay down these criteria, then you've got to have the administrative and intellectual kind of capital staff infrastructure to monitor, implement and intervene. And you know, FIFA spends most of its time in this regard worrying about whether Pepsi Cola is going to get an advert inside the 1 kilometre exclusion zone. And if they could pursue issues of social justice and of democratic urban regeneration with the zeal and the vigour that they protect international brands, you know, I think we would see something very, very different going on.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.